I am glad to be here with you all. And reading a talk, I know, will send shivers down everybody's spine, but I'm afraid if I don't, I'm going to get lost in one piece too much. So bear with me, and I will try to be lively. And I am happy to answer questions. If something pops up, don't be afraid to stop me. If you want to see something longer on the screen, I am happy with that as well, and I look forward to questions at the end. Thank you all so much for coming, and like I said, Mark and May have been excited to be here. Let's see. Alabama has a rich heritage in quilt making, as seen in many of the stunning and fascinating examples that survive today. As settlers moved west into the Alabama Territory in the early 19th century, they brought the possessions they could accommodate in travel and the traditions from their previous community. Thus, handmade textiles from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee survive in Alabama today and all influenced and informed quilt making. Once established in Alabama, the types and styles of needlework made by settlers followed national styles, but were influenced by other factors, including family and community traditions, the availability of materials, new local examples, published patterns in newspapers and ladies' magazines as available, and after the mid-19th century, exhibits at state and county fairs. And the thrill of going to these fairs and seeing quilts firsthand is written about so often in women's diaries and letters. They were just a wonderful, I think, both inspiration and social gathering. And the quilts were always so popular. Of course, experiences and duties of women varied, depending on so many factors. However, textile and clothing production was one activity that occupied a significant portion of all women's time. And while the weaving and production of fabric and making of clothing took its toll both physically and mentally, it's clear from letters and diaries that women took great pleasure in the making of quilts. Then as now, women express their artistic and creative impulses through this medium. American quilt making began to flourish at the time of the Revolutionary War and gradually replaced other bed coverings as a primary source of warmth and beauty. One of the earliest documented Alabama bed coverings is this stunning image on the screen. It's a tree of life, or known as a central medallion style, from the Dumont family in Mobile, made around 1800 to 1920. And it's very large, 101 by 86 inches. It has a cotton front and a linen back with a very thin cotton batting to allow for the quilting, very close quilting stitches. In the center, we see this slender vase filled with a bouquet of these wonderful, fanciful flowers. And then in the borders, the plumes with reverse applique. The entire surface is covered with a stipple quilting, creating a dramatic texture. It was purchased by the noted quilt historian Florence Peto, who sold it to the collector Electra Havemeyer Webb, who was the founder of the Shelburne Museum, which has a fantastic collection of quilts. And for all of you interested, if you haven't had a chance to go to Shelburne, I totally recommend the visit where this quilt is today. This quilt, according to family history, was made by Martha Hobbs Lucas around 1800 in Limestone County. It contains English chintzes, copperplate printed fabrics, and very large too, 94 by 94. It's not a quilt. There's no filler or backing. However, it is completely finished, hemmed at the edges, perhaps intended as a summer spread. Certainly, it was intended to display the fine needlework skills of Miss Lucas and its handsome fabrics. At the base here of this tree, there are these little copperplate printed textiles, which they depict images of Dick Whittington and his cat, with that story about the cat creating his fortune for him. And so, there was access, but these would have been quite rare. And there's a close-up, little hard to see, a little faint, but I hope you get an idea. And extremely well made. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all whites, but I do want to say the other type of bed covering among the earliest made in America is the whole cloth spread or quilt, made from either one piece of fabric or more often several widths of fabric seamed together to give the appearance of one piece. These, particularly made in all white, were most popular at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, but continued to be made into the 19th. This is a detail. The all whites in a full slide just don't show up, so I'm really going to focus on this detail. Was made by Mrs. John Taylor Adair for her daughter, Anne Orr Adair of Tuscumbia in 1827. It's 96 by 84 inches. Anne was 16 at the time, so it could have been part of her trousseau. These all whites are truly remarkable for their intricate quilting, but they're most admired, I think, for the stuffed work and cording that decorate the surfaces. The bed covering was assembled and quilted, and then the cotton was stuffed into the back for the reserved areas of the design. So, such as you see, this tulip, you would separate the fibers and stuff the cotton in with a sharp tool like a bodkin. You do see some quilts where they have been snipped and then re-sewed, but obviously that was not preferred. This quilt that you see here, a scrap quilt or utility quilt, was made by Mrs. Naomi Ford Smith of Chilton, Clark County, between 1825 and 1850, and it's a rare survival of a utility quilt made out of available fabrics. The palette is so pleasing: blue, beige, brown, of various size squares of cotton and wool, perhaps cut from worn-out clothes or sewing remnants. Some of the fabrics are solid, others a check or a plaid. You can see that Mrs. Smith carefully cut and seamed the straight edges of the scraps together, creating her top. This quilt is truly a scrap quilt, not a crazy quilt. It was created by a different method and look from the crazy quilts made later in the century, where the asymmetrical pieces of fabric are adhered to a ground fabric. Fine quilts with lavish fabrics and needlework are more likely to survive and not be used up, are more likely to be used on special occasions and thus have a better chance of survival. They're not used up with a usin', as the expression goes. So for this quilt to survive, I think is extraordinary. It may have even existed inside another quilt used as a lining as part of its survival. Oh, and the inner lining is of wool, which is unusual for an Alabama-made quilt, and the quilting thread looks hand-spun. This Whig rose was made around 1820 and was made in Montgomery County. The quality and combination, and I'm going to go to the detail because I think it'll show up a lot better, but I think the scallop border is so handsome the way it frames the roses. But here you get an idea of the quilting. The quality and combination of forms of needlework make this quilt outstanding. The loosely woven backing fabric allowed cotton to be forced through, forming slightly raised areas on the surface. The quilting stitches, as you can see, are close and regular, creating a stippled background, as well as elaborate plumes and floral motifs. And each appliqued flower is embellished with embroidery. It's very thin and was more likely for show than for warmth. And again, I apologize. Do you think we could turn off the front lights here, maybe? Or I guess that would turn off everything in the room. Never mind. The other one, but I have two more that will show this one better. This is a princess feather quilt. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Is that better? And the next one will be a lot more clear than this one. This was taken not under the best circumstances. Much has been written about and speculated about quilt making among the enslaved and free blacks. Africans were not familiar with bed quilts, but they did know the techniques used to make them, piecing and applique. And the enslaved and then free blacks became a very important part of Americans' quilting tradition, which obviously continues today. Family history relates that the princess feather on the screen was made by enslaved individuals on the Cogburn plantation near Montgomery, about 1830 to 1850. The quilt is appliqued with red and green plumes applied to a white ground and quilted in an overlapping circle pattern. A strip of white cloth is visible in the center of each plume. I'm going to move on to the next one, which shows this better, and I'll describe it in a minute. This quilt, where the appliqué fabric is turned under, revealing the supporting cloth, a technique known as reverse appliqué, which is difficult and time-consuming. The strip of white ground creates a rib. Here's a detail, centered in the feather. The princess feather was a popular pattern, but the reverse appliqué was less frequently used for obvious reasons. The Cogburns had substantial wealth, he a planter owning over 22,000 acres and 59 enslaved individuals. An intriguing mystery is that an almost identical quilt to the one I started with, this one is in Mississippi at the Historical Society, and this one is in the DAR house in Mobile. Almost identical dimensions, but there's not been a definite relationship established. But there you see the reverse appliqué of the rib, which I think is absolutely stunning. This Star of Bethlehem, or Lone Star, was pieced by Elizabeth North Clark in Monroeville in 1849 at the age of 19. And here you see Miss Clark. A detail of intricate quilting, which I wanted to point out. Here's the quilt as a close-up. And I wanted to focus on the quilting. A letter which descended with the quilt stated that Elizabeth Clark had made the star and that it was quilted by an enslaved woman called Aunt Peggy, who was known for her outstanding quilting skills. Her truly expert quilting stands out on this dazzling star. Her intricate design includes birds and flowers, leaves, and just a dizzying variety. Truly outstanding quilting. During the 1840s to 1860s, album quilts, such as you see the one on the screen, of all types were very popular, linked stylistically to what are known as the Baltimore album quilts, named for the city in which the style began, where between 1845 and 1855 this quilt was very popular. Usually a cooperative project, the quilt is composed of blocks made by as many as 30 or 40 individuals, designed to be presented to an honor recipient, such as a teacher, a minister, a bride. In this way, each person who makes a block makes a contribution to the overall design. This quilt dates from 1858 and is truly a visual and historic treasure. While the Baltimore album quilts depicted monuments and reflections of city life, this quilt truly reflects where it was made. The squares are filled with plants grown in the South, such as the fig, sweet gum, and watermelon. And I want to point, here's the watermelon down here that you can just see, this little pink watermelon. And one of my favorites is up here, which is Tree of Knowledge, with a little calico serpent that is coming up from the base, about ready to spoil everything. I have to say, too, that using the American flag in dating a quilt, which looks wonderful here, is generally an unreliable dating source when depicted in quilts, because accuracy is less important to the maker than the overall effect of the design. In this case, you just see this wonderful, handsome centerpiece of the flag flapping in the breeze, but the number of stars is incorrect for the known date of 1858, 30 instead of 32, and the flag has 11 stripes instead of 13. I'm happy to direct you after the presentation to the issue of Alabama Heritage Magazine, where the collector of this quilt, Robert Cargo, who became a superb collector and historian of quilts, and a historian from the University of Alabama, Dr. Ward Hubbs, dissect each element and date this quilt precisely to when and where it was made, locating every family member through the signature. It's just a tremendous and impressive amount of tremendous and impressive amount of research for all of you people like me who just love those little, going into every little detail. Unraveling what Dr. Cargo was told about its history when he acquired it and what he was able to ferret out makes just for a great read. Women in the South were, of course, working to support the war efforts during the Civil War, providing clothing and cover as much as possible. There are so many letters that you can read in the Alabama Department of Archives about soldiers writing for, can you send me clothing, particularly socks. People were just so desperate for socks and for cover of any kind. However, the high price of fabric and its limited availability curtailed production significantly. Some women, however, were able to create quilts for fundraising purposes. One of the survivors is a particularly magnificent example known as the Alabama gunboat quilt. We are indebted to Briding Adams, former Curator of Decorative Arts at the Birmingham Museum of Art, for her remarkable search on the gunboat quilts. And there's a great article I can direct you to on that. This quilt was made about 1861 by Martha Jane Dixon Hatter, who lived on a plantation outside of Greensboro in Hale County. Her husband was deceased and sons serving in the war. The quilt is one of two she made, where each were auctioned to raise money for the purchase of a gunboat to help defend the port of Mobile during the Civil War. There were a number of gunboat societies formed by women across the South to raise funds specifically for the purchase of gunboats to defend coastal towns. I will go back. Here is what the gunboat looked like for all of us. As the war progressed, it became evident that the funds would be better used to help the wounded. Mrs. Hatter contributed 2 magnificent quilts that were auctioned off for the effort. One was auctioned 4 times, the second twice, and returned to Miss Hatter. And this quilt today is at the Birmingham Museum of Art. Her other quilt is at the White House of the Confederacy in Montgomery. Farther north of Greene County is the Hill Country, an area in stark contrast to the rich cotton fields to the south. The Hill Country was defined by subsistence crops consumed locally. Most families owned limited household furnishings, some livestock, and a small amount of land they farmed themselves. The quilts found here are smaller than those in the Black Belt, enough to cover the bed with a little overhang. Quilts are thicker to protect against the colder temperatures and held together by simple, straightforward quilting stitches or tied with yarn. Backs are often whip-stitched over the front. You don't want to spend all the time and materials doing a separate binding. Mary Ann Rouse Thomas, who you see here, and her husband, William Mabry Thomas, this is their home, and it's in the Hill Country in North Alabama, and I think it really indicates the kind of environment I was talking about in the last paragraph. Mary Ann was the great-grandmother of Dr. Robert Cargo, and her quilts, many of which you can see draped here across the railing, given to him by his family, became the touchstone for his collection and his passion and appreciation for quilts. He has written eloquently about Mary Ann and her influence on him and the collection it inspired. So, in particular, this quilt. Here is Mary Ann and her dates. A very long life. Here is Dr. Cargo with one of his quilts. And here's the quilt, her Seven Sisters quilt, which is one of the ones that you saw draped on the railing, made between 1875 and 1880. Robert often wondered if the Seven Sisters was for the star constellation or for her 7 daughters. She had 7 daughters and 6 sons. And she had time to quilt. I'm a slug. Next, we see her vibrant pine tree or tree of life, made about the same time. This has been a popular pattern throughout the history of quilt making. Mrs. Thomas used a myriad of prints most effectively, and she's framed each of the tree trunk with a striped fabric, creating the illusion of a field or a horizon. Her use of black is particularly effective. Robert called attention to the capricious handling of the black stripping, and her boldness in the design. Someone said to him after a presentation, "Your grandmother must have been a very independent woman," meaning her just ability to just sort of break the grid. This is what I want to do, handling that dramatic stroke. I was talking to Carole a little bit before we started, and Mary Elizabeth Johnson and Carole King, in their excellent book, Alabama Quilts, Wilderness Through World War II, ask a great question. Why were there not more quilts created describing the meteor shower of 1833, the night the stars fell on Alabama? It was described by the Florence Gazette as, quote, thousands of luminous bodies shooting across the firmament in every direction. One eyewitness reported the stars fell and fell, thick as snow, coming down, and all thought Judgment Day had come. It was such a good question. The only quilt I have come across which may refer to the meteor shower, we don't know for sure, is this example made by Jenny Rembert, a black woman living in Demopolis when she made this dramatic shooting star quilt around 1880. So that's, over 40 years past the event. Likely it was inspired by stories and oral history of this remarkable event. This pattern may have originated with Miss Rembert. It's made of cotton and backed with flour sacks. It has continued to stay in the family. During the last quarter of the 19th century, there was a significant stylistic departure from the traditional bed quilt. The crazy quilt, popular from about 1875 to 1890, broke from the geometric patchwork and floral applique patterns popular during the previous decades, and instead embraced what we might call a modern or abstract design, a very original approach which emphasized a random arrangement of irregularly cut fabrics. At the apex, the style favored silks, satins, velvets, commemorative ribbons, along with other elaborate materials and methods. Most of these quilts were not made for the bed, but instead as throws or for interior decoration that primarily provided platforms for this elaborate needlework. The fad crested quickly, peaking between 1875 and 1890, and quilts of more prosaic materials, wool and cotton blends, reinterpreted the style into the 20th century, such as this example as you see on the screen, made around 1910. The maker's delineation of each square within a yellow zigzag stitch is especially effective, and this is made with wool and cotton blends. While elaborate compositions were the desire of makers of these crazy quilts, it can be argued that few reached the creative height of Martha Douglas Montgomery of Montgomery, Alabama. Mrs. Montgomery was described as an artist and a patriotic worker, one of the most prominent early workers of the Ladies' Confederate Memorial Association. She created this tour de force as a tribute to the soldiers on both sides of the conflict. The quilt traveled to several national exhibitions, and describing this quilt, one reporter wrote, "This quilt, made by Mrs. Montgomery of Alabama, is a marvel of patient work, taste, and artistic talent. It's composed of several hundred bits of silk, ribbons, and velvet, and put together with every stitch known to the embroiderer. Besides that, there are 77 pictures beautifully painted in watercolor on satin of the heroes, events, and depicting the battlefields of the late war. In the center is a picture of the inauguration of Jefferson Davis as President of the Confederate States, and in one corner is a white star cut from the flag, which floated over him when he took the oath. About the pictures of the battlefields are grouped the generals of both sides who took part, excellent likenesses, cabinet size, skillfully painted with her brush. In the border is set panels bearing pictures of the most prominent actors in the war. This marvelous piece of work has been accomplished in the short space of 3 months' time, and this week sent to the exhibition in New Orleans." Puts anything I do to shame. Jumping ahead quite a bit, at the end of the 19th century, there was a temporary decline in quilt making. The art was revived in the 20th century, especially with the concern for thrift in the 1930s as the Depression affected lives across the country. Women everywhere were encouraged to sew, quilt patterns from the 19th century were reintroduced, and new designs based on contemporary themes were also used. This Morning Glory, well, definitely not an example of thrift and using what's at hand, is typical of the colors and floral quilts popular at that time, and it is so stunning. I love showing it and seeing it. Other water lilies and irises were also popular, and designs often featured strong geometric motifs reflecting the Art Deco style. It was made by Bessie Sykes of Tuscaloosa County between 1930 and 1935. President Franklin Roosevelt and his administration were tackling problems generated by the Depression. The TVA, or Tennessee Valley Authority, was established in 1933 as one of President Roosevelt's Depression-era New Deal programs, providing jobs and electricity to the rural Tennessee Valley. Here you see Eleanor Roosevelt with co-owner Nancy Cook displaying one of their, the National Recovery Act, talking about seeing the National Recovery Act eagle. The National Recovery Administration, or NRA, Blue Eagle, together with the motto, "We do our part," is one of the most lasting symbols of FDR's New Deal. In spite of the short life of the NRA itself, which gave a psychological lift to Americans, it was not as effective as hoped and was declared unconstitutional, actually, after only 2 years. The eagle, unlike earlier examples with their signs of peace and war, holds the cogwheel of industrial progress with bolts of lightning to symbolize the burgeoning electric power of America. However, before its demise, Dr. Max Bond was summoned by the officials of the TVA to work as a personnel officer with the black construction workers at the TVA sites in northern Alabama, becoming the highest-ranking black man in the agency. He brought his wife, Ruth Clement Bond, and their young daughter, Jane, with him. The family chose to move into one of the government-built houses in the racially segregated village. I want to say here that I'm very indebted to Mary Kay Waldvogel and her research published in her book, Soft Covers for Hard Times, Quilt Making in the Great Depression, for this information, and what a great title for a book. I highly recommend the book to you. Mrs. Bond had been raised in an integrated neighborhood and had advanced degrees from Northwestern University, had taught English in both high school and college, but moving to Alabama changed all that as she was not able to find a position, and changed her focus temporarily. She became very interested in the wives of the workers in the village. She said, quote, "I decided I could learn from the women and they could learn from me." She became particularly interested in the local crafts, willow furniture, corn shuck rugs, dyed with local flora, etc. She began to gather with the women when they got together for quiltings. They were using the popular patterns of the day, and Bond developed the idea of making a pattern for a TVA quilt, representing the power of electricity would bring into their lives. She drew a full-length figure of a black figure. She drew a full-length black figure holding in his hands a bolt of lightning. She called it the TVA quilt. Rose Thomas, wife of Max Bond's assistant, decided to make a quilt from the design. She shared in an interview why she liked the quilt so much. Quote, "It tells the story of what was happening for the black man on the TVA dam construction sites. The women were excited about new opportunities and wanted to show them in their quilt designs. When asked about the white hand extending from a uniform sleeve reaching from the outside, she said, it represents the black man moving away from the hand of the law. In spite of the law, he is moving to become independent and an important part of society. She did not see the white hand as controlling the black man." Here you see a detail of this extraordinary quilting as well as this phenomenal design. Another one of her patterns that became popular and that several women made, it became known as the Black Power quilt. In describing the meaning of the black fist clenching a red lightning bolt, Miss Ruth Clement Bond said, "We were pushing up through obstacles, through objections. We were coming out of the Depression, and we're going to live a better life through our efforts. The opposition wasn't going to stop us." Ruth Clement Bond's history is fascinating and extraordinary, particularly her focus on human rights, and I encourage all of you to read her obituary published in the New York Times when she died at the age of 101. For many years, documentation of quilts and other textiles made by Africans brought to America was ignored or thought not to exist. However, we have learned that the enslaved and free blacks were an essential part of the American quilt-making tradition, and that many extant quilts, to quote quilt historian Questa Benberry, are visible evidence of the extraordinary proficiency of the makers. While Africans brought to this country were unfamiliar with the bed quilt, they were familiar with the techniques of construction, piecing, applique, and quilting. Benberry, Dr. Maud Wallman, and Dr. Gladys Marie Fry undertook significant research into quilts made by African Americans with particular focus on the quilt top. The styles reflect both Euro-American and African-American design traditions. The former, based on a grid structure, gives the top repetition and regularity. The characteristics of the latter have been linked to West African textiles. Wallman identified many similarities in design and construction between quilts made by African Americans and West African textiles, including bright colors, large designs, asymmetry, and multiple patterning. In addition, African textiles are created from narrow strips of woven fabric stitched together. An excellent example of this is Roman coins that you see on the screen by Mary Maxion from Bowling, Alabama, you see on the other side of the screen. This quilt was made in 1991, composed of 12 rows of small, narrowly stacked rectangles, which are then seamed together but not aligned, creating great movement and vibrancy. This is, however, there is an order to the arrangement, the outer columns. Here, I thought I had another picture of that, sorry. Here you can see this pink that just really stunningly frames the whole design in the center. And this photo of Miss Maxon, as I said, was taken in 1991. An extraordinary body of work by African American quilters comes from the Quilters in Gee's Bend, an isolated community in southwest Alabama. It's home to a small number of residents, now less than 600, who are descendants of enslaved people brought here in the 19th century. Harsh conditions and harsh treatment have created a tightly knit, resilient, and creative community. The women are now known internationally for the bold, imaginative, and stunning quilts, which are most often made from worn-out clothing, feed sacks, and whatever is at hand. The quilts are not only beautiful, but they also speak to the perseverance, ingenuity, and self-confidence of the makers. The quilt patterns are diverse, original, and often improvised. One of these patterns is housetop, which has been interpreted over the years in a wide variety of improvisations. Seen here, made by Joanna Petway in 1991. The quilt is made of corduroy, a fabric with great texture and sheen that is also easy to manipulate. Corduroy was introduced to the quilters of Wilcox County through their work with the Freedom Quilting Bee and provided an artistic catalyst to several of the Gee's Bend quilters, according to scholar Jane Livingston. In this quilt, the corduroy creates a dynamic series of ever-increasing squares or frames that seem to float and pulsate off the cream-colored ground cloth. Here we see housetop variation made in 1998, created by Mary Lee Bendolph and quilted by her daughter Essie Bendolph Petway a few years later in 2001, made of cotton, corduroy, twill, and assorted polyesters. In discussing this quilt in the book, The Quilts of Gee's Bend, Miss Bendolph recalled that a former Bend resident living in Connecticut had sent some garments, double-knit suits, to Gee's Bend and told Miss Bendolph's daughter to just give them away. But didn't nobody want them? That knit stuff, clothes from way back yonder, don't nobody wear no more, and the pants was bell-bottom? We ain't that out of style down here. I was going to take them to the Salvation Army, but didn't have a way to get them there, so I just made quilts out of them. The Quilters of Gee's Bend has received national and international attention, beginning with a major exhibit at the Whitney Museum of American Art, which traveled extensively. However, the quilts by makers from Gee's Bend in the area around Alberta and Rehoboth in Wilcox County were also given national attention in the 1960s, both for the extraordinary design elements of the quilts and the opportunity to forward civil rights. In the fall of 1965, Father Francis Walter, a young and extremely dedicated white Episcopal priest, moved back to Alabama to work with an interfaith group dedicated to voting rights and equal treatment for African Americans. While driving in Possum Bend one cold winter day, Father Walter saw a quilt hanging on a cold clothesline, so bold and bright that it looked like a pop art painting. He tried to approach the quilt maker, but he was alone. Quilt maker was suspicious of this white man walking into her yard, so he came back with a friend who knew her. He was then introduced to the quilters in the area, and seeing their quilts, he realized the potential for these quilts to bring needed income to the makers and be a pride and source of continued activism. With the help of a friend and several auctions were organized in New York City, which encouraged the establishment of a cooperative and a sewing center where the women could gather and work together. A friend of Father Walter's in New York who had contacts with media, art, and design began helping the Bee, sending fabric from New York. Word spread and sales were strong. In 1966, the Freedom Quilting Bee was legally incorporated. These changes meant that the lives of women and their families in the southwest corner of the state improved, as did their self-esteem. As Nancy Callahan wrote, they realized that their collective could make possible a new standard of living for their families, and more than that, it could gain economic independence for black women for the first time ever in Wilcox County. And reading what so many of these women have written or said in interviews about being able to buy a graduation ring for your child who graduates from high school, being able to provide for your family in ways that you didn't have before. It was truly a new day. For the next several years, enthusiasm for their quilts and related items remained strong, with orders coming in from national stores including Bloomingdale's and Saks Fifth Avenue. However, by 1968, the Freedom Quilting Bee leaders realized that to be commercially successful, they were going to have to standardize their product. Make a replicable product that customers could order exactly as they saw in the store. It had to be color fast. You can throw it in the washing machine. It had to be the same size, etc., etc. This gave continued financial success for several years, but it also meant that through standardization, the spontaneity was lost. This striking Star of Bethlehem, this striking, the Star of Bethlehem, made in 1968 by the Freedom Quilting Bee. Very large, 90 by 100 inches, is a hybrid in some way and represents the nexus between the original designs of the quilters and the impact of external influences. The star was a popular traditional pattern, is made of very fine fabrics, which differ considerably from the scraps used in previous quilts. Though, as Dr. Cargo so effectively pointed out, I am told the liberal use of black makes it typical of the early Alberta quilts. When viewed flat, the overall effect is of a magnificent star floating in the void of space. Used as a bed cover, as it was intended, the star is no less impressive, but the effect is totally different. It seems to fall over the sides of the bed in a surrealistic manner, limp and withered like Dali's watches. Another star, though quite different from the one just discussed. Sorry, guys. Coffee went down my Sunday throat, as my grandmother would say. Quite different from the one we just discussed is this broken star made by Afton, Germany of Talladega County around 1970. And I'll show Afton for a minute and then go back to this. Quilters have told me over the years that young boys between the ages of 5 and 10 often learn quilting as routinely as their sisters, but then rarely quilted past childhood. Afton, Germany was an exception. He learned quilting from his mother, and he continued quilting and doing other handicrafts throughout his very long life. Renowned quilter, Alabama quilter Nora Ezell, created several extremely fine quilts as memoirs or memorials to Alabama's civil rights history. Ezell of Birmingham, well known for her story quilts, and particularly for her 2-story quilts that both document and reflect on Alabama's civil rights history. This quilt, made in 1993, you see several important monuments to the civil rights history. 6th Street Baptist Church, a bust carrying the Freedom Riders in flames, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, particularly, and if we could see this, you would see how the bridge is made dimensionally. So the bridge literally lifts off from the top of the surface with the railings of the bridge standing up vertically. Nora stated, "I have so many memories of the 1960s, I could create a quilt from Greene County to Birmingham." Here you see her tribute to Dr. King, the Martin Luther King Life Story quilt made in 1986, highlighting some of his extremely significant contributions. Ezel did not follow a pattern. More often, her work took shape from a reflective and intuitive approach. I try to express my own feelings with a needle and thread when I make a quilt. You're going to have the opportunity to meet Yvonne Wells later today in conversation with Judge Susan Walker, and are probably already familiar with her outstanding work, but I thought maybe a little bit of background. Mrs. Wells made her first quilt in 1979 for the most basic of reasons, to keep herself warm. The making of it gave her pleasure, and she continued to make more, creating her own distinctive designs, and some pictorial, some abstract. On the screen is yesterday's Civil Rights in the South, made by Yvonne in 1989. She said she has felt it's crucial to depict key moments on the road to equal justice. I needed to do something to preserve this for my children, simple enough for anyone to understand, and it has to be factual. So you see everything from Wallace standing in the school door, courthouse door, to the memorial to the 4 little girls, lynching, picking cotton, etc., and Martin Luther King at the pulpit in the center. A quilt that may be less familiar, but an important one, and one that offers a superb insight into Yvonne's thinking and processes, is Raggedy Andy, made about 1982, 1983, and it was included in an important early exhibition of African American story quilts that was created by the Williams College Museum of Art and entitled Stitching Memories. This quilt was conceived without a story in mind. The artist had scrap materials lying around and began picking them up and piecing them on top of the other, some odds and ends of lace, her daughter's hair ribbon, her son's athletic socks. Quote, "I kept going until I ran out of things." And to continue in her words, "I leave lots of space in my art so people looking can see into whatever they want. I want people to imagine their own story. I imagine that quilt says a lot about me. I guess it says I'm not the greatest housekeeper in the world. I can leave everything lying there. That's my way. The cluttered section tells you about me. The neat parts that are largely blank and carefully stitched remind me of my husband. He's a perfectionist, very different from me. To me, the quilt speaks about incompleteness. It suggests that there are lots of things in life yet to be done. First, there's the clutter, the unstableness in life, then there's the blank. This suggests that there are aspirations yet to be filled in, but above all, this quilt speaks about touch and beauty, how even the crudest things can be fun and fuel creativity. If we have time, I'd like to close with a short poem written by a poet and spoken word artist, Patricia Smith, who saw this quilt when she was speaking at the Birmingham Museum of Art and was inspired to write a poem entitled Breath Sewn In. Fingers lose their bones easily, lost in the ritual of metronome stitch. A birth in a link of burnished thread, a death in a paisley square. A tortured move from country to city, from Alabama to Chicago, is trapped in a loop of thick, stunning red. My grandmother never stood completely upright. She existed bended, not yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, but the curve of creation in her spine. Her eyesight slimmed to a sliver, thin fingers working revolution, screaming, screeching, murmuring, resurrecting lost fathers, sons in uniform, a granddaughter who is first and foremost a back-locked slugger, a tugger of skirts. Now, I am a half-century of silver, and when midnight runs its chill fingers down the small of my back, whispering, sleep, I reach to the foot of my bed, pull up the quilt to cover my shivering with my own history and my grandmother's voice. Thank you so much.